All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our first of our Tuesday night series of learning. As I've mentioned in some of the marketing material, we'll be covering a number of topics through the Tuesday nights, but also covering Parsha. Tonight we have a special Shiur, which is a special topic, as we will be having special topics, as I said, through the different Tuesday nights. Some of them will be just on Parsha, some of them will be on unique and special topics. So tonight's topic, as was advertised, so under no false pretenses, tonight's shiur is on a very interesting subject, one which I think, I guess, captivates the mind, the imagination of so many of us because of its sort of unknown qualities, unknown properties, its unknown or sort of the mysterious aspects of this particular topic. And of course, I'm referring to reincarnation. So tonight, the objective of tonight is to cover a few things, and I always like to just give over what sort of topics we'll be looking at within the broader topic of reincarnation. So I want to start off with the first thing is looking at some of the, I guess, the modern world and some of the other thinking in terms of reincarnation. Is there any scientific proof, let's say? Are there any studies, perhaps anecdotal discussions about reincarnation? So we'll start with that just to get a sort of a more global view of the concept of reincarnation. And once we've done that, we will then, hold on, someone just messaged me something. Once we've done that, we will cover firstly, just looking at some of the central biblical sources for reincarnation, as understood by the Kabbalists. We'll look at what is the purpose of reincarnation. Now, obviously the fact that we're having a shiur on reincarnation, it's there to dispel, many people think, or at least in my discussions with various people, that Judaism doesn't believe in reincarnation. Some people think it's just a Hindu concept. Judaism very much believes in reincarnation, and we will discuss through our shiur why it's such a fundamental tenet of our faith and what its purpose is. We'll look at how reincarnation works. Now tonight, obviously with the scope of time, we're not going to cover every single aspect of reincarnation because there's numerous aspects of it. But we'll look at, as I said, some of the main themes of how it works. We'll look at how many times you can actually become reincarnated, and a question which I'm asked all the time whenever this discussion of reincarnation comes up is, can you come back as an animal, as a plant, as a bird? And we'll look at that as well. And finally, we'll look at the philosophical implications of the belief in reincarnation. So hopefully after tonight's shiur, you'll have somewhat of a concept about reincarnation. Why I say we won't cover most of you can talk about reincarnation for weeks. In fact, one of the greatest books or works about reincarnation in Jewish texts is what we call Sefer HaGilgulim, the book of reincarnations, which is a very mystical Kabbalistic book, and it discusses all sorts of interesting things. It talks about what sort of things you can come back and be reincarnated as, depending on what you did in your lifetime. So various and interesting things surrounding that. Now, because everybody's on mute, and obviously it's different giving a shiur on Zoom as it would be, if we were doing it here in the shul directly. So if you do have a question, feel free to post it in the chat. If no one posts a question in the chat, then what I will do is at the end of the shiur, I will unmute people and we can have a discussion. It might be a little bit more difficult, obviously, but feel free to ask questions. I'll try and address them through the course of the shiur. So as I said, we're going to start off with something interesting, the evidence of reincarnation. Of course, you're listening to a rabbi talk, so I'm going to be focusing on the Torah text, but I thought it would be fascinating, and I did a bit of research looking at some of the, I guess, the different scientists and researchers and others who have looked at this concept of reincarnation. And sort of, as I said, it's one of the central themes of Hinduism, in fact. But in terms of the belief in reincarnation, I was told that I looked up about 24%. This is obviously in America, and I'm assuming it'd be similar in Australia. About 24% of people in America believe in reincarnation. As I said, a lot of people in Judaism have always thought it's not a Jewish concept, but in fact, it very much is. So we're going to look at tonight, to begin with, we're going to look at how have others viewed this concept. And of course, the challenge of documenting reincarnation is that majority of people who might sort of have said, I've sensed it, I feel it, they don't really have a vivid recollection or recall of what, in fact, the reincarnation was all about. We will look at what Judaism says about whether you can sense your previous incarnation or not. So there was some very interesting, extensive research done by a person by the name of Dr. Ian Stevenson and Dr. Brian Weiss, and they collected a large body of evidence, and they said that they can support this concept of reincarnation from 4 particular areas. Again, this is not a Jewish belief. I said we would start with this for those who've just joined. The first area where they gathered information was what we call past life regression, remembering details of past lives, in particular when the person was under hypnosis. So if somebody went to a psychologist who could hypnotize them, they were able to recall details of a previous life. Now, if any of this might be familiar to anyone who's watching, of course, you might find this, fascinating. If you're not aware of such things, then of course, it presents a very, I guess, mind-opening experience to think that this is all occurring that has happened before us. The second area of research they looked at was the past life memories, children in particular, children remembering details. And I'll tell you a couple of stories that have been recorded. Interesting, very mesmerizing stuff. The third area, which they looked at, was what we call unlearned abilities, where somebody has the uncanny ability to do something which they have actually not learned. So, for example, speak a foreign language when they haven't actually had the ability to, or not the ability, they haven't had the education of learning that language. Their parents don't speak that language. They don't speak that language within their country. They don't speak that language within their schooling. And yet they're able to perform or speak, perform a skill or speak a language that they haven't learned or been trained to do. And the fourth and final area that they were looking at, what we call physical signs of past life wounds. So, for example, let's say a person, has a big birthmark on their chest, and then they certainly feel that they've been around before and they have, vivid recollections of a previous life. And then they research and they investigate and they talk to this person. It turns out that the person that they're imagining that they were before, they go back 50 years, they were shot, and the place that they were shot and killed was through the exact area where that birthmark is now found. So all these 4 areas of research have really opened up, in the sense that the scientific investigation has led to some type of evidence that in fact reincarnation does exist. And of course, we'll look at the Torah perspective shortly as we get through that. But a couple of things that I found very interesting. We spoke about the birthmarks, and there's been a number of studies where they looked at past lives. In particular, there was a scientist or physician or psychiatrist by the name of Ian Stevenson, and he was dealing with a patient, a child who had a birthmark, and the child was speaking about a previous life. And when they researched it, they found that in fact the child had a wound corresponding to a previous life that they had actually investigated, and it turned out that person had actually been around. And as I said, the paranormal behavior in children, for example. One story that I'd like to mention is regarding, it's in a book called, if you can look up this website, it's called childpastlives.org. Anybody wants to research that, childpastlives.org. And over there, it speaks about a family who, their 3-year-old child, 3-year-old son, who was, when they wrote the story, was almost 4, they were documenting and talking about the child had a very strong interest in being a firefighter. So whenever they went to the toy shop, he wanted firefighter equipment. When they did dress up for Halloween, whatever it might be, he was dressing up as a firefighter and always wanting to pretend he's chopping down trees and having an axe to break through walls and so on. And one time he said that, I don't know if he was pointing to a particular tower or whatever. He says, that's similar to the 2 towers that were knocked down. And this child had never learned about the Twin Towers, and the parents going to express that he was almost reliving and saying, yes, I couldn't save the people when they were on the towers. This is a 4-year-old kid. So they seem to believe that this child was a reincarnation of a firefighter that had been killed in the Twin Towers. So again, take it or leave it. It could be, you might think it's nonsense or narishkeit, but certainly as we'll get to the Jewish concept, this is what's out in the world. There was also another story, this is about an Indian boy in India who was telling his family about a particular, I think he was 5 or 6 years old. He was telling his family about another family that he was part of. He's saying, yeah, I'm part of it. And he told them the name of the company that he used to work in and the children he used to have and all these things. And when the child got a bit older, they actually ventured to this other city in India where they had in fact discovered that the name that he had given them, that the details he had given him. And when he got to the town, they actually tested him and said, point out who your brother and sister are. And he pointed to these older couple who happened to have been his brother and sisters many years earlier. And it turns out that they believed that he was very much the reincarnation of this other person who had been killed. Other aspects referred to, as I said, the speaking a language which you don't know. I don't know if anyone's ever had that experience. But there was, in terms of Jewish text, there was a person by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Astor, who was doing some work with Dr. Brian Weiss that we spoke about. And he said that a case came before them where parents had these two-year-old twin boys, and the boys were speaking this very strange and sophisticated language. So they didn't know what language was. They brought the child to the linguistics department at Columbia University, and they worked out that the boys were speaking Aramaic. Now, of course, this is not a family which had anything to do with Talmud studies and anything like that, and the scientists could not believe what they were hearing, that these two boys were fluent in Aramaic. So again, where does that come from? And so I guess the concept really is to show you that there really is, I guess, even in the secular world, in the secular studies, in the investigative concept, that there is a previous life, a past life. But what does the Torah say about it? How do we process it as Jews? And most importantly, besides for the fascination of it, does it have any purpose for us to know that we can get reincarnated? So what I thought we would do is we'd look at, firstly, in order to understand reincarnation, I just want to give it a bit of background about the existence of the human being in this world. How does Judaism, how does the Torah view our existence? Right? Because in order to understand reincarnation, you've got to understand the life that you're living right now. And the truth is, this is not anything new, I don't think, to anybody here. But the idea is really that our existence in this world is but a temporary one. And if you look at most Jewish texts, you look at Perikei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, in many of the different traditions, we speak about this world being just a temporary entryway, if you like, to the next world. And the question is, what is the next world? And where does reincarnation fit in within that scope of the next world? But just very briefly, we know that we have the body and soul duality. Hashem, it says, if you go back to the right in the beginning, the human soul, it says Hashem formed man from the earth of the ground. And this is the one of the most extremely important verses in the Torah. It says, Vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim. Hashem blew into his nostrils the breath of life. What is that breath of life? The neshama, the soul. So our existence, the true existence, is the soul. It was that life that Hashem blew into us. Nishmat chayim, the soul of life or the breath of life, is who we are. The body is but just a mere vehicle or vessel that houses this soul. If you look in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, it says, and the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to Hashem who gave it. Of course, we say that at, God forbid, at a funeral, we speak about the soul returning to its maker. And so the soul and the body return to the source. The body returns to the ground from which it came, and the soul, of course, goes to the next world. That's very, very, I guess, the primal concept within the concept of reincarnation. I mean, the concepts of the body and the soul. Now, if you look in the book of Dvarim, I just want to show you some texts which give hint to the concept of reincarnation. So that tells us that we have a soul which goes to the next world. But where do we get a sense from the Torah that we actually can come back again? So if you look in the book of Dvarim, Moshe blesses Reuven at the end as he's, in a sense, giving his final words of rebuke and praise to the Jewish people. He says, Yechi Reuven va'al yamut. Let Reuven live and not die. Yechi Reuven l'chai alma umot tanina lo yamut. Let Reuven, says the Targum Onkelos, let Reuven live an eternal life and let him not die a second death. What does it mean, let him not die a second death? And the Onkelos says that Reuven shouldn't require the rectification of reincarnation, which would cause him, in a sense, to die a second death. This is already giving us some type of very entry analogy or an entry information to what reincarnation is. He says, let Reuven not have to die a second death, which seems to imply that another life is required for rectification, for fixing something up, which we'll talk about in much more detail as we get on with the Shiur. Okay, so another hint to this concept of reincarnation in Torah text. So we spoke about Reuven. There's a very interesting halachic concept, and some of you may have learned about this concept, but there's a rule in Jewish law that if you have brothers who dwell together, so you've got two brothers who are living together, one is married, and the one of them dies and doesn't have any children. So one of them dies childless. It says that the widow shouldn't marry anybody else other than this brother. Now, if the brother refuses, we know there's a whole process called yibum and so on. But in biblical times and post that, she would then marry the brother. And why, says the Gemara and said others, that it shall be that the firstborn that she bears shall succeed in the name of his dead brother, that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. And on this, the Zohar says, what does it mean that his name is not blotted out from Israel? So you would think it just means simply he's carrying the surname of, obviously they're brothers, and the child from his brother will carry the same surname. But the Zohar, which is the foremost work of Kabbalah, says V'hai ihu raza de Gilgul. It says this is the secret of reincarnation. That what? That the son born to the husband's brother from his deceased brother's wife is a reincarnation of the deceased brother. So very fascinating, saying that a child that is born will be the deceased brother's reincarnation. Now, there are other sources who say that no, you can't say that that's definitely the case. It's not always going to be the reincarnated soul of the brother that died. But nonetheless, we see that there is certainly scope to find it in our biblical text. The Ramban, so Nachmanides, we've been obviously focusing on the Rambam recently with the end of the cycle of studying of Rambam, but the Ramban, he says there that the matter of reincarnation is a great secret from the secrets of the Torah in the genealogy of mankind, which he says is known to the eyes of seers, to whom Hashem has given the eyes to see and the ears to hear, and the one who is wise will understand. The Rambam is, of course, referring to the secret of reincarnation, which means that very few of us, unless you happen to fall into the description of what the Rambam says, that you are a seer of these great mystical secrets, we don't know who is a reincarnation of who. Now, if you do look over the last number of weeks of the Parsha, you would have heard, if you've been studying somewhat, if you've been listening to some of the varying commentators, reading some of the varying commentators, you do hear this concept happening every now and again. You'll hear that Pinchas, for example, in last week's Parsha, it says Pinchas was, Eliyahu was the reincarnation of Pinchas. And you'll hear at different times, it will speak about certain characters in Tanakh, in the biblical times, and it will talk about how some of them were reincarnations of other characters in biblical times. So again, we see that there's certainly this concept of reincarnation or coming back into this world. Now, we're going to get to, in a moment, we'll see how there's going to obviously be some type of purpose to all of this, and we'll obviously go into that in more depth. Just something very fascinating that's brought in terms of the work of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon says, if you take a look, and we'll read this, please God, we'll be reading it in Shul this year, but if you take a look at the book of Jonah, the story of Jonah and the whale, the Vilna Gaon says that entire story can be seen as a metaphor for reincarnation. How does that work? So I'll explain to you. It says, right, of course, the factual, true account of Jonah's mission, the Vilna Gaon sees this as an allegorical interpretation of reincarnation. How? He says, Jonah is the soul, right, the neshama that we are given. We are charged with a mission to fulfill in this world, and we'll talk about that mission. The neshama boards a vessel. So Jonah gets onto the boat. What is the vessel? The vessel is the body. Okay, but the person tries as best as he may to flee from Hashem, to run away from God, to avoid fulfilling his or her mission. And eventually it says that the person is swallowed up and departs from the world, leaving your task unfinished. What happened after that? The word of Hashem comes to Jonah a second time, and he says, get up, go to Nineveh. So the whale, in a sense, regurgitates this person. He's now given another chance, and he's sent back to earth to complete his or her mission. And so we see that the whole story is just an allegory in terms of us entering the world the first time, trying to fulfill our mission, and we'll talk about what happens if you don't. So, in a sense, biblical sources clearly tell us that there's the physical body, the spiritual soul, that soul enters into the body, and this idea of reincarnation, which obviously has remained a Kabbalistic secret. Up until late in Jewish history, they didn't really talk about this in the depth that we talk about it today. It's definitely alluded to in many places in the Torah, as I mentioned. We speak about different people who are reincarnated as different people, and the Kabbalah, which reveals usually the inner workings of the Torah, certainly speaks about this reality of reincarnation. All right, I'm just seeing if any questions. No questions. Okay, so the question is, what is the purpose and the nature of reincarnation? If we can come back again, what is its purpose? Each of us in this world were created what we call B'Tselem Elokim. We all were created in the image of God. What does that mean? So according to Kabbalah, this Tselem Elokim, created in the image of God, it refers both to Jews and non-Jewish people. And the foundation of reincarnation is literally based on the principle, the fact that we were created in the image of God, B'Tselem Elokim, it means that we have got the potential, and Hashem has charged us with the goal of reaching perfection through our own free will. So you've been created in the image of God, and so therefore your potential is that you can reach godliness. But if you don't achieve that perfection, if you're not able to, if you succumb to the challenge of this world, if you succumb to the temptations of this world, which, as we know, we're all human beings, and we certainly do, the question is, do you have another opportunity to complete that goal that Hashem set for us originally, to become truly in His image? And the answer is yes, you will be given an opportunity. However, and we'll talk about this in more depth, it could be that there might be times where you need what we call transmigration. So you be a gilgul into another thing, like into animals or plants, or even an inanimate object, which is going to require, purifying the soul independently of your will. So let me explain what I'm talking about. So obviously this concept of reincarnation is very, very profound. And even though we're talking, and I'm giving you text, and I'm giving you insight from those who've come before me, it's still extremely profound and complicated and complex. And I don't think anyone really has a proper grasp of reincarnation. We're given tidbits, we're given insight into it, but does anybody really know who is what and what is what? Yes, some of the great Kabbalists perhaps did understand that. But each of us is created in this world to earn perfection. I know it sounds a rather lofty level, but we can reach perfection, or we're supposed to reach perfection. What does perfection mean? It means that the fulfillment, in a sense, of every aspect of you, every atom that comprises of you human being. Hashem has faith that each of us can achieve the goal and doesn't give up on any of us. And so therefore reincarnation, it allows a person to reach perfection by perfecting different components of the soul that were not achieved in your previous lifetime. And that's why you'll understand soon why you may not come back as a human being. You might come back as an animal or a flower or an inanimate object. And what I mean by that, so here why I said we're not going to get into too much detail, because Sefer HaGilgulim does go into a bit of detail in terms of what does it mean to refine parts of your neshama. We know that there's 5 levels of the neshama. We call nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. These 5 levels are all comprised in themselves of levels within levels within levels. Each time you do a mitzvah, each time you do a good deed, each time you live in this world, you are refining. It's almost like you're polishing parts of the soul. The way that I like to describe it is, if you can imagine, for example, imagine this was this was sort of a jug. And each time you did something good, or each time you did a mitzvah, you're filling up that jug. So you're refining, if you like, parts of your soul. So you might live your life, this world, so you might live 80, 100 years, however long. These God may have an estimate to 120, but you've only refined this much of your soul. And so therefore your neshama needs to come back down again, and might needs to get refined there. It might be you've got up to there, and so you only need to refine that much more. And we'll see what implications that has in terms of reincarnation. But that's the concept. The concept is you've got these 5 levels that need to be refined, and it could take numerous reincarnations for you to work on that. The Ramchal, who was known as Reb Moshe, he was Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. In his sefer called Derech Hashem, he goes on to explain what it means. He says that the purpose of this world, Hashem, if you think about it, today we're living in a society where we're going through some challenging times, and I'm sure it stopped many of us at times to think, what is the purpose of this world? And Reb Chaim Luzzatto explains that Hashem's purpose in creation was to bestow of His goodness, of His good, onto another. His wisdom was therefore, in a sense, decreed that the nature of His true benefaction be His giving the created beings the opportunity to attach themselves to Hashem. He wanted us to have the ability to become godly, to become able to attach to Hashem. But in His wisdom, He decreed that in order for us to really be perfect, what had to happen? In order for us to really enjoy this concept of being perfect, what did we need? We need to earn it, right? You can only be perfect in the way that Hashem saw it is if you earn it. Hashem could have just simply said, boom, you're all perfect and you don't have to do any work. It was necessary then, what did Hashem give us? Hashem gave us what we call free will. The free will, the ability to choose. Now that in itself is a whole shiur. How do you really understand the concept of free will? But let's just accept that we have a choice to do good or not to do good. And so in order for Hashem's goal to be best achieved, it was that we had to have these two opposites, these two inclinations that were vying, if you like, for control over what you're going to do. We have what we call the nefesh elokit, the godly soul, and we have the nefesh abahamit, the animal soul, if you like, the soul which sort of animates us. Each of these, and then of course you also have what we call the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which is trying to sway this animal to become bad and to drag it into the mud, if you like. So each one of us is drawn towards our nature, and so the body part of you inclines in a sense to the material, the animate, and of course the soul leans towards the spiritual, and that's these clash that happens each time you are presented with the opportunity to do good, the opportunity to connect to something spiritual, to learn Torah, to do a good deed. You're going to have this other force sort of pulling the rope and saying, do this, do that, and so on, and that could be very, very challenging. And so this physical world, if you like, if you could describe it, it's the battleground for man's free will. Right? Think about that concept. It's the battleground for our free will, and therefore it gives the soul the opportunity to perfect itself. And as we saw, which we spoke about previously, if you don't perfect it, which very few do, you have another chance to do that perfection. So the question is, the Arizal in his chapters, remember I spoke about this concept of the Sha'ar HaGilgulim. The Arizal was a very famous Kabbalist from Tzfat. He mentions a number of reasons why you might need to be reincarnated. Knowing this concept of our purpose in this world is to become perfect, is to emulate Hashem's ways, is to become in the ways of Hashem. We have to look at as well, if that doesn't work out, why would you need to be reincarnated? And our result says there's a number of categories which can relate or a number of categories which can cause the need for reincarnation. The first one, he says, it could be repairing spiritual damage that was incurred through a transgression in a previous life. So if you transgress something, you might need to be reincarnated to repair that damage that was done. So remember we said you got to reach perfection, but the Arizal says besides reaching perfection, you might cause a blemish within that soul. So you might not have refined it, you might have actually caused damage, and that needs to be repaired. The second thing he says is that, like we spoke about, achieving the perfection that you hadn't achieved previously, so you're wanting to rise in that elevation. And the third one, he category says you might need to be reincarnated for the purpose of actually helping another person reach spiritual perfection. So your entire existence might be to help another person. Now, it's interesting because I remember as a child, we used to sing the song in school, in camp. It was to love a fellow Jew, just to do a favor for another for 70, 80 years, the neshama wears and tears, just to do a favor for another. Like we would sing about that. You might be in this world for 70, 80, 100 years, simply just to do a favor for somebody else. Now, the common denominator between those three reasons is that we need to come back to this world to fulfill and complete our essential calling, which we had not accomplished in our previous life. The final thing is reincarnation could also be, and I don't want to scare anybody, and it's always the grim part of reincarnation, it could be a source or a reason or a form of punishment, right? Now, even if it's for a punishment, ultimately it's for the benefit of the soul, which is able to reach its potential by coming back to the physical world for whatever reason it needs to come back to get purified so it can then fulfill its mission. Now, you might be wondering what happens when you fulfill your mission. What if you've gone through your reincarnations you've done? So when you fulfilled your reincarnation, that's when you go to the world of souls, the world of Olam Haba, the world which we always think about when we talk about our loved ones that are in the world of souls. They're basking in the ray of Garden of Eden, right? Now, there are some Kabbalists who explain, I've heard it explained, that parts of the soul which are refined, they might then, the soul it's like a candle. If you take a candle and you light another candle from one candle, you don't sort of take away from the first candle, you are creating more candles. So in a way, it might be that parts of the neshama which are refined, those aspects of the soul could then rest in the world to come, could rest in the Garden of Eden, and it's the other aspects which need to come back down into this world. However that works, again, it's beyond our physical comprehension, but let it be said that reincarnation can help, which will say that when a person does die, God forbid, you might have heard these concepts. When a person dies, they go to what we call Gehinnom. That's why we say that when a person says Kaddish for a loved one, you shouldn't say Kaddish for more than 11 months, because it says that only the truly wicked need 12 months of purification in Gehinnom. So if the soul is getting purified in this purgatory or this type of cleansing in the world to come, why do we need reincarnation? Surely the reincarnation is not necessary if the soul is getting cleansed. But again, we spoke about it's not only about getting cleansed, it's about lifting up and elevating yourself to that perfection, which doesn't happen in Gehinnom. And it says that there's certain parts of your soul which cannot get cleansed in Gehinnom. They need to return to fulfill their specific mission. So certain sins, certain things that a person did in this world, Gehinnom might not be enough for them. They might need to still come back down to this world. And as I said, purifying your levels of your soul are also going to require you to come back. And so as long as a person is unsuccessful in fulfilling your mission in this world, Hashem will uproot us, if you like, and replant you over and over again. Now, the Chafetz Chaim, many of you are familiar with the Chafetz Chaim's work, he writes that a person who was wealthy, for an example, and never assisted the disadvantaged, didn't care about them, never gave tzedakah, it says that the Chafetz Chaim says he might be reincarnated as a person who is poverty-stricken. And why? In order that they will now understand the need or the necessity of tzedakah and the plight of a poor person. And it goes on to say that, the famous question, and again, I'm being very careful what I express, because I'm not trying to say that if somebody is poor, God forbid, they should feel that, it's a punishment that I wasn't good in the world before me. It's just giving some aspects and some possible explanations and ideas. But if you look in the Sefer HaBahir, which was written around the 1st century, it says to explain why good things happen to one righteous person and while bad things happen to another righteous person, right? We see that all the time in this world. It could be that the latter may have done something in their previous life, says the Sefer HaBahir, and is now, in a sense, experiencing the consequences. So whilst we might only see our world through just a very narrow prism, if you understand this concept of reincarnation, you understand that you're just part of a puzzle of something else. Now, I did, when I gave a shiur similar to this a number of years ago about reincarnation, there was somebody who asked me a question and said, how do you know if you are a reincarnated soul? So I did some research at the time, and it turns out that most of us, probably majority, if not 99% of us, are all reincarnates. Most of us have lived previous lives. Our neshamot were unsuccessful previously and possibly will be unsuccessful again. But it says that if you find yourself, or if you've met someone who is mesmerized, who is interested, who finds every little aspect of this world fascinating, it says that they might be a brand new soul. And it's very rare that there's a brand new neshama that comes to the world. And again, I saw it was written that somebody who finds things, you give them a piece of paper and they're like, oh wow, this paper. Most of us, we get bored after 2 seconds of seeing something new. So I don't know if that's a clear proof, but it's the only thing that I found in terms of recognizing whether you might be a new soul or whether you might be a reincarnation. And most of us, as I said, are reincarnations. So that's what the Chafetz Chaim writes, that you might see that a person who's suffering, it could be that they haven't done anything wrong. They're not wicked. but they might be experiencing something based on what's happened in one of their previous lives. And there's a very important principle regarding this concept, and that is Hashem, in a sense, arranges matter so that, in a sense, we have a chance of achieving this ultimate salvation, and we do that through another time of being reincarnated. I'll tell you an interesting story that occurred, which is a bit of a scary story, and it will come up in terms of the nature of reincarnation, which I'll mention in a minute. They say the Baal Shem Tov was once traveling to a city, and as he was traveling through, he stopped at one of these inns, and there was a sort of this bar where the people who were traveling came and had a drink, had a l'chaim, and he noticed that one of the people drinking took this glass of whiskey and was about to swig it back. This is the version that I heard, and without saying any bracha, he saw the guy was Jewish. So the Baal Shem Tov said to him, he said, "Excuse me, why are you not saying a bracha?" And he says, "Bracha, shmacha, I don't believe any of this nonsense. I'm not religious. Please don't bother me." And the Baal Shem Tov said to him, he says, "Do you see or sense or recognize anything special about today's date?" And the man thought and said, "Look, I can't think of anything." And the Baal Shem Tov said, "I want to tell you a story." He said, "I want to tell you a story that there was once a man who lived in this world who didn't care about saying thank you to God. He didn't have any gratification. He wasn't grateful. He didn't ever say, benedictions or blessings. And when he died and his neshama went up to the next world, the world of truth, or the judgment day, they said, look, he hasn't been a bad person, but he just never thanked Hashem. He never said blessings. And so we're going to be sending his neshama back down. But this time, it's going to have to happen on its own. He's going to have to be passively rectified. How do you get passively rectified? You get brought back down not as a human being with free will. You get brought back down as either an animal or even an inanimate object. And it says that this person was brought back down as a grain of wheat. And the purpose was that until someone said a blessing, a bracha on this person's soul, right? So until someone would take this grain of wheat and make a blessing on it, this neshama would be stuck down here in this world. And now you can imagine for the soul, it's quite tormenting. It wants to go into the world of souls. It wants to go and rest, but it's here in order to be rectified. So ultimately, it's for its good. But until such time, it's painful. And this soul, it says, goes on for years and years. No one's saying a bracha. It gets harvested as whiskey and wheat, and eventually it gets brought into a bottle of vodka or whatever it might be, and it gets set to a little inn in the middle of nowhere on a shelf. And then the neshama gets very excited one day where it says it sees a Jew walking into the bar. And this Jew orders a glass of the vodka and is about to drink it, but he's not going to say a bracha. The Baal Shem Tov says, you, my friend, are this person. If you say a bracha right now, you're going to give the soul comfort, and it can now leave and go back to its final resting place. It can go to the world of souls. And the man didn't believe it. He said, this is crazy. And the Baal Shem Tov asked him, what's special about today? I want you to think back. And it turns out that day was the yahrzeit of this person's grandfather, his Zayda. He says, it's your Zayda's neshama that you had the chance to rectify or not. Now again, they say if you believe every story of the Baal Shem Tov, you are crazy. But if you don't believe the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, it says that you are a non-believer. So based on what we just learned, it certainly fits in with the text and the works of the Kabbalists, who express that if you didn't reach your perfection, you might have to come back down. And as I said, sometimes it's literally just going by means of a passive event. So a person might have to come back down as an animal. Now, in the Sefer HaGilgulim, it does express certain, they're pretty creepy things, to be honest. It talks about certain sins that a person might do and what type of things they might come back as in this world. It doesn't mean that, so for example, if you did a particular sin, you might come back as a cat or as a bird. It doesn't mean that every cat you see or that every bird you see is the soul of Chaim Shmero running around, or the soul of Sarah Mushka running around, right? But it's possible that they've come back. And I know that there's been times in my life where I remember I was in a city called Welkom. For those who are from South Africa, I was the rabbi. I was only 14 or 15, but I was there for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur in this very small dorpi, this very small town. And I remember it was Yom Kippur, and I was the chazan. I was standing on the bima, and I remember this bird flew through. It came into the shul, and it literally landed right by the bima, and it sat by the bima for almost the entire morning service. And I think you think about it, maybe this was the neshama of somebody who had to come and hear a Rosh Hashanah service, who maybe never went to shul, or never went to shul Yom Kippur. Who knows? It could have just been a bird that maybe there was some some seeds lying around. But ultimately, according to this, according to many of these works, there is certainly, possibility to believe that it is a reincarnation. The question, which is, I'm sure many of you are wondering, because we spoke about some of the secular science and investigation and evidence whether a person can be aware. According to the Sefer Haredim, the Kabbalists say that even though a soul reincarnated in human, that even though the soul which comes into a human body is unaware of its initial incarnation, nevertheless, it says when it's incarnated into the body of an animal or a bird, it's actually aware of its former incarnation, and it has the anguish or the regret over how it has descended from the human being to the form of a beast. So like that story, the grain of wheat, the neshama recognizes that it was that. When it comes back to a human, the human is unaware. It doesn't mean that it could possibly be that there is some feeling or emotion or something that, they call it a deja vu, where your neshama feels that it's experienced something to that extent. Now, how does it determine what type of reincarnation you're going to come back in? So according to the Sefer Hal-Gilgulim, the Shar Hal-Gilgulim by the Arizal, he says, after a person dies, you are punished for the transgression in many ways before you enter in Gehinnom. And these ways are called Gilgul. And so therefore you may be reincarnated in an inanimate object or a plant or in an animal or a human being. And most of the people will not escape their being reincarnated in these ways. And the degree of transgression determines whether you will be reincarnated in one of these forms or shapes. So again, depending on the sin, depending on where you will then therefore be reincarnated. And so to sum up this section, and we'll get into the final section, the soul, which is the spark of the divine, we've got this mission in our world to perfect itself, to change the physical world, to change and clothe within this body. That's where we're given the mission. Should we fail that mission, then we have another opportunity through reincarnation. How many times can you be reincarnated? According to some of the Kabbalists, maximum 3 to 4 times. Others say that as long as your soul is continuing to do what it needs to do, so it's continuing to be purified, it can go on and on. But let's say after 3 times it's unsuccessful, that for some reason 3 human beings or 4 human beings that is reincarnated all don't seem to get the message and keep doing bad things, it might not be able to reincarnate it again. And some say it could just sort of be banished in a way. Others say that Hashem does the help and allows it into the world to come. I'm not 100% sure because there's no clear evidence either way. But the reincarnation, as I said, benefits the neshama, it benefits our soul, even that which Gehinnom can't do, because it gives you the opportunity to perfect that concept of and the mechanism of free will. And as we said, the number of reincarnation depends. The Zohar, as I just said, as long as you are perfecting yourself further, you can be given as many chances, because each time the soul is getting that benefit. Now, the conventional process of reincarnation, as we said, involves human to human, but a human soul can be reincarnated, like we said, just to summarize, as an animal, plant, or even an inanimate object for the purposes of passively being involved in a mitzvah, passively being involved in fixing something up. Final section I want to look at, or second to final really, is what are the philosophical implications of the belief in reincarnation? Meaning, incorporating the possibility of reincarnation into our worldview can really change our perspective on a number of issues. Right? If you believe in reincarnation, like I already alluded to in the beginning, for example, the suffering of innocent, the injustices in the world, even the purpose of life, all in a sense take on a new meaning. Now, please don't get me wrong. I am not an expert in knowing why people are suffering. I'm not an expert to see what injustices are really not really injustices because it's reincarnation. All I'm opening to you is a window to the possibility that the things we see, we don't always understand because they are perhaps the second part of a series, which we haven't seen series number 1. Right? It's like watching a TV show where you've missed the first 4 seasons and you're watching season 5. So you're just coming in from a very late picture. Now, since the purpose of reincarnation is to provide a second or possibly third or fourth chance to perfect yourself, we can learn from this that the job of the soul perfecting is up to who? Each and every one of us. right? The Mishnah Berurah, in fact, whose halachic work, he said that a person may repeatedly despair of correcting his or her faults and concluding that Hashem decrees that he dies because of his failures and so on, but as a mistaken attitude. The soul will always will be given an opportunity, not always, but will be given an opportunity to correct its mistakes. And so the question is, what does that change for us? So that story that I told you earlier hopefully gives you a little bit of insight that we have to be very careful in this world to not overlook a mitzvah, to not overlook a particular character of yourself. It says that sometimes if you find yourself drawn to be perhaps, you might have a particular character trait that's very strong. So let's say you're extremely generous. It might be that Hashem's given you this ability to do tzedakah. Or it might be that you feel extremely selfish or extremely miserly, that you don't want to give. This could be that Hashem's testing you and saying, I'm giving you this ability to overcome your character. Right? So the secret of the matter is that every one of the sages that was particular about a mitzvah, it was because they understood that that particular mitzvah was lacking in one of their previous Gilgulim, one of their previous incarnations. So never underestimate just doing one more thing, because that could be the purpose and the fulfillment of what you need to come back down as. Right? And the previous life may determine the challenge that you face in this world. So if you're going through a particular hardship, or if you've suffered a particular loss, or you've gone through a particular challenge, maybe this is exactly the challenge that you need to go through, because this is your rectification. This is, Hashem is saying, how are you going to react to this? I'm giving you the free will once again to rectify what was not done in the world previously, in your life previously. So it's a very fascinating way of looking at things. And the famous question which we spoke about, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? Sometimes it's not exactly what you see it. Right? Hashem could be bringing you back down, and it's not in fact, that you've necessarily been being bad. You're given the opportunity to help rectify something that somebody previously did. Right? There's also human injustices. There's an interesting case that is brought about Parshat Mishpatim. It speaks there, the Degel Machane Ephraim. It speaks about, let's say you have two people come in front of a judge to claim money, and it seems that the judge is perverting justice, right? And he awards the person who seems that they shouldn't be getting the money, and the person who seems to be losing the money, you feel that is being injustice. But it says that if you look at, and then this judge goes ahead and gets robbed, right? So if you look at the case just from a very simple point of view, you'll say, everybody was unfairly, judged over. It was unfair. The person who had to pay the money shouldn't have. The person who got the money shouldn't have. And the judge who got robbed shouldn't have been robbed. But the idea is that if you go look at the Gilgulim previously, you might find that the person who was awarded the money, they really had suffered in the world previously, that somebody had robbed them. So now they were being rewarded. The person who lost the money, who you think is, who's unfortunately being, punished, you go to the world before, and he was actually the one who stole the money. And the judge who got robbed, he was possibly also somebody who did bad things in the world, in the previous world. So from our very limited knowledge and our very limited scope, we see that there is a bigger picture out there. Now, what I'm about to say in the next part is really no comfort to anyone, God forbid, who's lost somebody prematurely. God forbid the death of a child, the death of somebody who's died young. However, the Chafetz Chaim does say, and again, I would never say this to somebody in the midst of their mourning, and certainly not even a few years after, but God forbid if somebody loses somebody prematurely, the Chafetz Chaim does say this, and these are not my words. The Chafetz Chaim says that when somebody dies young, it gives you the perspective that possibly the reason they've been taken early is because they fulfilled that rectification. If the whole purpose of coming to this world is to rectify your soul, is to rectify things Hashem wants you to, perfect yourself. Most of us are already reincarnations. And therefore, if you need to rectify something and you come into this world and after a few years you've rectified it, then you fulfilled your purpose. And so therefore, God forbid, lo aleinu, if there's an infant who dies, God forbid, it could very well be that infant's come to just bring a bit of joy, even for a little bit of time for their parent. Or it could be they've come here for the parent to say a bracha, or for something to say a blessing. Who knows? I don't know, and no one really knows. But the Chafetz Chaim says, you don't have you might. It's not that they're being punished, not that the child did anything wrong, God forbid. In fact, it could be that they've done something right. Interestingly, in the Chazon Ish, who was a very, very spiritual man, it says that he would often stand up for anybody who had a disability. In particular, if a child came in or a person came in with Down syndrome, it says that the Chazon Ish would stand up for them. And once he was asked, why do you stand up for children with Down syndrome? And listen to what he answered, again, referring to reincarnation. He said, each of us is given faculties, right? The faculties that we're all given are there to help us reach our potential, to reach our connection to Hashem. The greater gifts and faculties that a person is given, the more obligated you are to achieve, right? The more ability you have, the more you should achieve. And he said, therefore, a person is therefore created far away from a goal, but you're given the tools to get there. If somebody is born with lesser faculties, not that they've got worse or they're better or worse, but they've got lesser faculties to do certain things, it means that in essence, the person of limited capabilities is actually closer to perfection than you are. And so the Chazon Ish said, when anybody who has a disability or anybody who had something like a Down syndrome, he felt that they were actually on a much spiritually higher level. They were like almost like tzaddikim. Why? Because they were nearing the end of their mission. They were much godlier, much more spiritual, much more loftier. And so therefore, he said that even that person might even be the reincarnation of a great tzaddik who's achieved near perfection, but needs to come into this world just to achieve a little bit more. And he said such a person is certainly worthy of such respect. And so therefore, the possibility of reincarnation changes your perspective on life. If reincarnation, in a sense, awaits the soul that leaves the person, that leaves this world unperfected, then the responsibility for perfecting one's soul cannot be shirked. Each of us has a responsibility. Never underestimate the ability that you've been given and the work that you can achieve. And it helps us have, again, just to recap, it helps us understand some of the philosophical questions, like why do bad things happen to good people? Why do innocent people suffer and die? Why are some people naturally more gifted while others have some other challenges? And as I said, taking reincarnation into account can also change your perspective on the seeming injustice in the world, whether it's human or divine injustice. And so, to summarize, reincarnation is certainly a very strong Jewish belief. Most importantly, because it tells us that we are primarily soul. This world is a place for us to perfect that soul, to work on that soul. All of our story, each of us, that leads us to, in somebody who's converted, let's say, for example, that's a classic case of where the neshama may have got sort of lost on the way, and now the person has refound it. So it's now continuing its mission. So that soul has been reincarnated, in a sense, to this body. And so every mitzvah we have, every sort of way that we might see things, it's all could be very much based on how we have lived previously. Now, can you recognize or feel, your previous incarnations? So as I said, according to the Torah, according to Kabbalistic view, you don't really understand who you were previously, although there are texts which do allude to that you might have a feeling, you might have a sense of something. I know there was, I was reading last time when I prepared this, there was, someone who was going for therapy, sort of was very scared of fire. And after some therapy, they recognized that they had actually been an incarnation of somebody who, Lo Aleinu, who was burned in the Holocaust, right? So this neshama had already experienced that trauma, that type of harm and pain. And so there could very well be things that you might sense that your neshama has experienced or has some emotion towards it. But ultimately, no one really knows that we are a reincarnation. We don't know who our previous incarnation was, but we do know that we have the opportunity to rectify things. So I will stop over there. I will open up for any questions. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to try it by unmuting everybody. It might be a bit of a balagan, but I will try and see if it works, if anyone does have a question or a comment. But I will stop the recording now. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into reincarnation. Some of the concepts I said, there's still much more to discuss and to analyze and to explore. But ultimately, I hope it's opened up, if you haven't studied the subject before, it's opened up some insight and some understanding as to who we are as human beings. What's happening around us is very much not just as the eye sees it. It's way beyond the things that we possibly see and understand just with our simple vision or understanding. So I will stop.